My name is Jerry Hiett. I was born in Halstead, Kansas, and my birth certificate and my dad's birth certificate both dated 6 a.m. March 7th. Originally, my father was one of 3 sons of the gentleman that raised Persian horses for the farming business back in early 1900s. And he left that farm, and moved to Hutchinson, Kansas, and became the manager of a hobby farm for an extremely wealthy automobile dealer. Sometime or other during the years, we had every type of horse there was. My father's name was Fred Hiett. Mother's name was Edna May, but she did not use the Edna. May Dickerson Hiett. And I was in Denver at the time, but my parents, the second time they came down. They came down originally in the late 50s, and my father was manager of Bella Vista for E.L. Keith, which he didn't stay there very long because he didn't like the mode of business that was he was being asked to conduct. And he went into town and leased a drive-in restaurant that is now where the taco store is on Bolton Boulevard, right a couple blocks of Main Street. And then they moved back to Hutchinson, came back, but they fell in love with Rogers and Bentonville area. They came back in a couple of years later, and we came down for a visit. I had sold out my interest in a photography studio system in Denver, and we came down for a visit and never left. We stayed. Well, I was in my 30s. It was a small town. I think the population of Rogers was about 5,000 at that time. Bentonville was about 2,000, roughly. In fact, my wife says, "Oh, I miss the old Rogers." We lived here from up until about the turn of the century. We never took a key out of a car when we parked out here. We never even locked any of our doors. There wasn't any need to. There wasn't any crime in Rogers. I had a background in newspapers originally. Then I had been in photo studio business, and I got down here and I joined my father's auction business because we decided not to leave. And I handled the business department and he handled the merchandise part. And I would go in the newspaper and they talked my language and I talked theirs, and we just got to become friends. And about a year later, they asked me to join the staff as executive editor. Well, I'd been editors before, news city editors and different editors, but I'd never been the absolute top editor in a newspaper, and I took the job. It was a modern operation. It was ahead of time for most newspapers in Arkansas. The publisher was Don Reynolds. If people should be familiar with his name, if they go to Fayetteville, to university area, and Mr. Reynolds was ahead of his time. He was a major, he had newspapers everywhere, but the number one newspaper, if you looked at Don Reynolds' airplane, that number on that tail number was the date that he bought the Rogers Daily News. It was his favorite newspaper. It was best equipped in the chain. And so it looked very progressive. And we were afternoon newspaper at that time, but it was one of the first offset newspapers, whereas most of the newspapers around here were letterpress. The morning news was shortly after I got there was fully offset. The transition, I had left the paper before the transition was complete. I started it, but I left it. I came home one night and my son said, Grandma and Grandpa and his big sister going to the fair. And I said, don't I get to go? And he said, no, you never get to do anything with me. 2 weeks later, I was no longer editor of a newspaper. I left. I quit. My son told me I was spending too much time in the office rather than spending it with the family. And a lot of people would not have taken heed to that, but I did. And I went back into the family business where I could be with my family rather than be sitting in an office separated from them 18 hours some days. Because the newspaper, the editor's job, I didn't punch the time clock. I spent all the time it took to do the job. And I spent too much because I've always considered myself a perfectionist and I spend too much time doing things. I had a staff of reporters and they wrote the stories and I edited them and laid the paper out, how it was put together, and that was basically my job. However, if there was a big story and city council meetings, the average reporter thinks that's a stupid job, waste of time. I've had people tell me that. That was what the city council's doing is the most important running news story of any town. If you don't know as a citizen what's going on, you're in trouble. And if there was a big public hearing, when they were having public hearings in Fayetteville about what is now Interstate 49, I was there, covering it. I didn't send a reporter. I had been a photographer since I was a teenager. Is how I got in the newspaper business. Originally was because of my photography in years earlier, and nobody ever saw me when I didn't have 3 Nikons hanging around my neck, one over each shoulder and one around my neck. And because in those days you didn't have the zoom lenses like they do now. You had telephoto lenses, medium range lenses, and wide angle lenses. And that was you had to have 3 cameras, or you had to switch lenses real fast. But the day I left the newspaper, I walked across 2 blocks or so to the city hall and picked up a petition for council. It was in August, and that's just timed right, because I had always been interested in politics. In fact, I majored in political science, college, with a minor in journalism. But I did not believe anybody in the media should be in politics. If you look around, it's almost universal that most people in newspapers today are in politics. But I didn't believe in that. And the day I left the newspaper, I took out a petition for city council, was elected, and served for 20 years. It's important to not be connected, not be a journalist that's in politics, because there is no one, I don't care who they are, how strong they feel about their unbiased posture, they're biased. It's just human nature. If you're running the newspaper and you're in politics, you write about how great your ideas are and you poo-paw the opposition, and that's not right. And I don't think anybody can say that isn't pretty common anymore. It always has been.
What are some of the stories you remember maybe that were big back in the day when you were covering news and as the editor had to make decisions of how to cover them? What were some of the stories?
Well, one of them was on a Labor Day weekend when he knew that there wouldn't be anybody working. A gentleman that had a business right immediately south of Ichiban area of Rogers had moved a street. It was dirt at that time, but he moved it about 20 feet north to make 20 more feet in his used car lot. I just happened to be going by there, saw it, and got out, took pictures of it, called Jack Cole, who was chief police at that time, and he was stopped, but he had the street moved by the time we got it.
Well, how do you move a street?
He bulldozer. He just flat bulldozed the street up and moved it over. Just went sideways.
Was it paved or dirt?
No, it was dirt. There was a lot of dirt streets in Rogers at that time. In the 70s, it was New Hope Road. There was a 2-lane track. I mean, two tire track. No, you couldn't meet anybody on New Hope without somebody stopping. There was just 2 tire tracks, grass in the middle, grass on both sides, and if you was going east and somebody was going west, one of you had to pull off over in the grass and stop while the other went on by, and then that person that stopped went back over in the lane and took off. If it had been a big rain, you was in trouble, because there's no base of any kind. There was a story about Ulrich. We were coming back from, Jack Cole and I were going back to our offices together as after a Rotary meeting, and he got a call from his office that there was a problem out on Ulrich. We're just leaving the Holiday Inn where the club had met, and we turned left at Ulrich and went out to where the band is in Ulrich now, and there were steel posts across the street. It was Ulrich, like some other streets, were dirt at that time, and someone had decided that road shouldn't go on west because that was his property west, which wasn't, but he thought it was, and he put a row of steel posts across the fence to stop traffic. Well, my first run, I ran unopposed, which is the easy way to get elected. Opal Beck had been councilman for years. She ran Modo Day in downtown Rogers on Walnut. She had decided to get out of politics, and I filed for her position. Unopposed, I was elected. I later had people run against me, but because there were people that didn't like my way I voted. When I voted on city council, I looked at the future, and if knew we were going to grow. I knew we had to increase our services, and a lot of people didn't want to do that. They didn't want to spend that money on building up, hiring new firemen, hiring new policemen. In fact, at that time, our fire department was volunteer. We had a fire chief, and a couple other people. Everybody else was volunteer. And I knew that we couldn't run a good-sized city with volunteers forever. And so, by after the first year on the city council, I became the chairman of the Public Safety Committee. That was police, fire, civil defense, and building inspectors. That was a mouthful. Daisy, when they came down here, started the boom in Rogers. We had boom years before with the apples and then with the chickens. But when Daisy moved in and they were let it be known what their results were per man hour on their production, other businesses, Crane Deming, plumbing company, plumbing supply company, heard how happy that Daisy was here with the employees. They moved a plant in, and they found out within 2 years that the production per man hour in Rogers was half again bigger than it was in any other facility, any other manufacturing plant they owned. They let that be known. And businesses, big companies started moving in. Union Carbide moved that big plant in here. Now they're known as Clorox, but it was Union Carbide that started the Glad bag plant out on 13th Street, and ran 24 hours a day making trash bags. And they dominated the trash bag business nationwide. And it was from what was produced in Rogers. They again reported per man hour, their production was higher than anywhere. And that just kept bringing in more and more businesses, and we got to where we are today. I went back in the family auction business. We were basically antique auctioneers. My grandmother went in the antique business in 1907. My dad grew up in the antique business, and I grew up in the history business. We were the leading auction firm in Northwest Arkansas for years until I retired. And when I retired in 95, I believe there were 30-some people in Benton and Washington counties that advertised themselves as auctioneers. Antique auctions are a different world than most people think of as auctions. They say, oh, you must really know how to talk fast. I didn't talk fast. I talked rhythmic to get people. That's a psychological thing, the rhythm. But I didn't talk fast because I wasn't selling cows. I was selling antiques, and my average buyer was 65 years old or older and a lady. I had more than you came to my auction, which I had my people all sitting down in chairs. Everybody, all the other auctioneers were out in the yard walking around selling stuff. And I never started an auction that I didn't have a coat and tie on. That was me. I mean, in fact, people say, what's that thing on your glasses? Well, it's a magnifying glass, but I put it on in 1970s because I was selling pieces of silver and china and glassware that could bring as high as, I've sold pieces of crystals for like above $10,000. And if you don't know what that piece is, you don't get that kind of money. You have to know more than your crowd does. As a councilman, we knew that Rogers was going to grow because of the industries that were coming in here, one right after the other. And you can't keep bringing in industries without bringing in people to work at them. And we had, it was a balancing problem for the council because we had to stay ahead of the growth, but we had to always anticipate what the growth was going to be. And that was tougher in those days than it is now, because we were started out at 5,000 people and went to 55,000 people overnight. And now we're still growing, but it's not at the rate we were growing at that time, percentage-wise. One of the standout mayors that I served with was Jack Cole. Jack Cole had been police chief. He had come here from Dallas, Texas, where he had been with another police agency, a national police agency. And he came here and built the Rogers Police Department into a one-of-a-kind for the town that size. And I went over there one night after I was still with the newspaper when I went over there, and because Jack asked me to come over, he wanted to introduce someone to me, and it was Mike Jones. Well, I took one look at him, and he was the scroungiest looking son of a gun you've ever seen in your life. Look hippie all the way. And I thought, what in the world? Is this somebody that they are arrested for drugs or something? Well, that was the night that Mike Jones came out from undercover. He had been working undercover for quite some time. And when he came out, they arrested. They kept the courts busy for months handling all the drug-related charges. And later, Mike was chief of police. Another one of our best outstanding chief of police. And but Jack was a one-of-a-kind. I served John Sampier for years. John and I had worked together on the Bicentennial Commission in the 70s, 74, 75, 76. Mike served as chairman of that, and I served as activities chairman for 2 or 3 years. He served as mayor. He took us into what was now the museum storage facility. It was at Poplar and 3rd Street, where the city bought the Masonic Lodge when they built a new one and put the city in there. To start with, the museum was a bicentennial project. And John Zampier and I were both on the board, on the commission. They called it the steering committee, Revolutionary Bicentennial Steering Committee. And Vera Key, a well-known lady here in town, came to ask to come to our first meeting, and she asked this committee if we would support a museum, and we all agreed that we would. So that became our first project. All other projects throughout the year were that raised money, were funds for the museum. And my whole family, including my 2 children, who were 3 and 6, I believe at the time, became friends of the museum before we had a physical museum. And they were the 2 youngest members of the Friends. When we got back on later, my father was one of the original commissioners. I was very supportive of the museum as a member of the council. I made sure that they had what they needed to run. Museums, in my opinion, are important because they tell the story of the past. If we don't know where we came from, we don't know where to go. You have to have continuity, and museums are a tool. It's amazing. I served 17 years on the commission, and I'd be there, and somebody would come in and go through the museum, and they would ask about certain things, and we'd explain to them what, and they couldn't believe that things like that had ever happened in Rogers. The average person on the street doesn't know that Will Rogers, who was at his time, and he was at the time he lived, was one of the best known entertainers in America, was married to a lady from Rogers. And they were married in Rogers. The average person doesn't realize that they know, most people know that the city's name for the president of the Frisco Railroad because he brought a railroad through Rogers, but they don't realize that, well, right in front of my house here's the original traffic route for Northwest Arkansas is the Butterfield Stage route. Old Wire Road from all of them throughout started in Old Wire Road, theoretically started in the straight line and went by the Pea Ridge battlefield and on down through Rogers, Springdale, Fayetteville, and on south to Fort Smith. And that was the stage route. And that's how they got around. So actually, in my opinion, Rogers didn't start by the railroad that a lot of people will say. They started by the stage. And if you don't know that, you can go to the museum and you can learn it. Some of the old timers know, but a lot of the newer people don't. The Rogers, first they were apples, was our first major crop. The vinegar plant, that's now a flea market, was one of the biggest producers of vinegar in the country. Spee's vinegar now, became Spee's vinegar. It was the chickens. That was something that was fitting to the area, was chicken houses, and we started raising chickens. Very few people realize that the chicken industry also brought some industries like Campbell's Soup in Fayetteville. And they brought something that the average person would never know. When you eat that pot pie, or those the frozen section of the grocery store, what used to be called TV dinners was invented in Fayetteville to get rid of the chickens that we were producing. We had all these chickens, and Mr. Shreve, that was president of Campbell Soup, says, I bet you if we put those in a chicken pie and froze it, we could sell millions of them. He did it, and he sold millions of it. TV, that was just the right period. TV was just getting universal. TV had been spotty up to that period, and about the time our chickens got plentiful, why people were starting to sit down in the living room watching TV because they had to watch that crazy thing because it was something new, and they ate their supper there. And he gave them something to eat. Pauline Shreve, here, his wife, was one of the major antique dealers in this part of the country and was one of our good customers and one of our good friends. And I never used her name Pauline very often. I said number 51 because she had, that was her permanent number, and our auctions was number 51. A lot of our population today doesn't realize that Coin Harvey, that built Montenay, ran for president. Was on the ballot for president nationwide on the Silver Party. A lot of people today don't even know that we even had that was ever Ichiban, but on that bar and U-Haul place on South 8th Street, Ichiban was the brainchild of one of our, at that time, relatively new citizens that had moved here from New Orleans because he had 2 small children starting school, and he was so wealthy at the time that his children couldn't go anywhere off the compound without armed escorts. They couldn't go to school without it. He built Greystone at the end of Highway 12 bridge. Took years to build, and he brought his family up here moved up here into that, and at that time he was so much wealthier than Sam Walton, and there was no comparison. Willard owned he was the importer of Volkswagens from Germany. He owned the docks where they docked in New Orleans. He owned the ships that hauled them to New Orleans. He owned the truck line that hauled them to the dealers. He had $1 or $2. And his sons decided they wanted to learn judo. So he built Ichiban. They also like tennis, so that's what the building is now. U-Haul agent was 2 full-size championship tennis courts on their roof in a building. And when he dedicated that, he had a big event. It packed. The Ichiban had their judo mat was the largest judo mat west of the Mississippi River in a town of size of Rogers. He had a party after the event. He brought in chefs from New Orleans, sent out invitations to everybody that was anybody in Rogers, and to be at his house for a party. And they produced food for 200 guests. Those that showed up was his Sam and his wife from Walton's, his doctor and his wife, his banker, Lawrence Harris, and his wife, his attorney, Marty Croxton, Virginia and I, and Bob Hough. That was the crowd that showed up for the party. The next day I ran into Beth Hough, whose husband was president of Daisy and grandson of the founder of Daisy. And I said, Beth, where were you yesterday? And she said, Jerry, I just feel so, Willard has so much more money than we do. We just don't feel comfortable around him. And I said, Beth, you think about how much money you got and how much money I have, and you tell me if that isn't probably what I could say about you. But what would you think if you heard back somebody said, Jerry said he just doesn't feel comfortable around you. She said, I never looked at it that way. But Willard he and I became very good friends. And he had a contest every year at the high school. One little girl and one boy, if they could anybody in school and seniors could write an essay on why you should not smoke. The best essay by one boy and the best essay by one girl got a brand new Volkswagen. Drive to school and make all the other kids say, maybe it would pay not to smoke. I think about that time is when they started the big nationwide push against smoking. And they started passing laws that you couldn't advertise. And the day I met him, I was editor of the newspaper. I was sitting there at my desk. He walked in, he introduced himself. He was small in stature, but when you looked at him, you knew he was somebody. And he introduced he was Willard Robinson, and he was going to build this big sports complex here in Rogers, and wanted to give me a press release, which I took, and we ran it. And he started coming in with updates, and we ended up talking. And then he came in one day and he said, I'd like to see where we stand today. He said, can you go to lunch today? And I said, yeah. And so I went to lunch with him. Well, we did that for a while, and we'd go out and look at things. And then one day he just said, let's just go to lunch. And we started going to lunch. And it was weird. People thought, what in the world is that joker? How in the heck is he running around with this ultra billionaire? And it was just because we didn't care about money. Wayne just fit. I liked him. He liked me. We just went from there. And when he died, I was really, it affected me, just like if an old school chum that I had been with for years had died. The Houghs were very instrumental in changing the politics of the state of Arkansas. Overall, it started in northwest Arkansas when they came here, there was only one elected Republican in the state of Arkansas, period. And that happened to be the sheriff in Benton County. And there was no other Republicans elected. And they started the Lincoln Day dinner. And in fact, the first Lincoln Day dinner Virginia and I went to, there were 12 couples. It's a little bit different today, but there was 12 couples at that Lincoln Day dinner. It's gone that far. And it went from like it was years when there was like one or two Republicans voted, in office anywhere in Benton County, and and a lot of it was from the Daisy people. They were all Republicans when they came here, and they brought a big, I believe it was in a 1970 Lincoln Day dinner. There was 12 couples at the dinner, and it has grown immensely from that. But I can't recall who the speaker was at that meeting today, but he was very instrumental in the Republican Party, National Republican Party. He had held election office in Washington, and because the Houghs had that much influence with the Republican Party. It's heaven on earth compared to most places today. It is Northwest Arkansas. It has terrific scenery, terrific people, has terrific economy. There's nothing that you can want that we don't have. Now we even have like entertainment at the AMP and things. We have the lake, if you like boats. We have hiking trails. Some of the longest trails you can walk from here at Fort Smith if you want to. It just, there's nothing, I can't, if you ask me what's the worst thing about Northwest Arkansas, I can't tell you, because I don't know anything that's really bad. My favorite thing about Benton County is the people. We don't have any bad elements that I can name. It's overall, we have a good population. I was sitting on the city council one night when a gentleman or a crew of people came in and said they were interested in relocating their business here. They wanted to start a new business. No, not start a new business, but they wanted to start a branch here. They were from Belgium. And they made steel wire for radial tires. And they had decided Tulsa was working like crazy on them. And they said, we've looked everything over, but there's one thing Tulsa can't give us, and that's what you have here. The scenery, the recreational facilities, the type of people you have here. We're going to build our plant here. It's going to be out on Hudson Road. Is the site we've picked. It will be 10 acres under one roof to make steel radial tires. They were just making the steel, and they moved their plant here. And the gentleman said, to show you how much we think of your area, we have plants all over the world, in every country, major modern country. This will be the only plant in the world that is not on a waterway to ship our product out and ship our steel in. And we're going to truck it in, the heavy steel, to make those wires out of, and we're going to ship the wire out by truck. And he said, it'll be the only plant in the world that does that. And it still is, to my knowledge. The company was Becker Steel, and they are still on 102